The failure of the family finally decided to show up. My father said it without raising his voice, which somehow made it worse. I had barely taken off my coat. Daniel was opening a bottle of wine at the kitchen island. Mom was carrying a casserole to the dining room, and Dad was carving roast beef like he'd just commented on the weather. I was 35 years old, owned a small furniture restoration shop, paid my own mortgage, and still felt 16 whenever Richard Carter measured my life against my brother's. "Good to see you too, Dad," I said. Daniel glanced over, but didn't laugh. He knew where this usually went. "Before I continue, tell me, how old are you? Where are you watching from? And have you ever had your own family decide who you were before you got a chance to answer?" Dinner started normally enough. Daniel talked about Carter Components expanding another production line. Dad asked about projected margins. Mom beamed when Daniel mentioned the board had approved his latest financing plan. I listened, pushing potatoes around my plate. I'd once been expected to join those conversations. Dad had practically designed my future before I finished college. MBA, management rotation, executive office. Instead, I left business school and eventually opened a workshop restoring old furniture and architectural woodwork. I loved the work. What I hated was how often I still caught myself explaining it like an apology. Mom asked whether December was usually slow for me. "Actually, I'm booked through February." "That's good," she said carefully, the way people praise a kid's lemonade stand. Dad looked at Daniel. "Your brother understood early that stability matters." I set down my fork. "Can we have one dinner where my life isn't Daniel's cautionary tale?" Mom sighed. "Emily, nobody said that. Dad did. Daniel built something with his life. You had every opportunity, and you walked away from all of it. You've always been the failure of this family." The table went silent. Normally, I would have made a joke. That was my flaw. I called surrender keeping the peace, then resented everyone for accepting it. This time I stood. "Then stop inviting me here just to remind me." Mom followed me to the entryway, asking me not to be dramatic. Daniel called my name once, but I kept going. Outside, the late November air cut through my sweater before I reached the car. I drove home angry at Dad, but even angrier that part of me still wanted him to call and take it back. He didn't. At 9:12 the next morning, my phone rang while I was repairing a cracked walnut cabinet door. The caller was Martin Hale, my father's longtime attorney. "Emily," he said, "I need you at a family meeting Wednesday afternoon." I almost laughed. If Dad wants an apology, he can call me himself. This isn't about dinner. His tone changed. "It concerns a $36 million transaction your father cannot complete without addressing your role." I stared at the cabinet clamp in my hand. "My role in what?" Martin paused. "That's what we need to discuss." By Wednesday afternoon, I had convinced myself the $36 million had nothing to do with me. That was easier than imagining an explanation that made sense. Carter Components occupied a red brick complex outside Pittsburgh, and walking through the lobby still gave me the strange feeling of entering a future I had once been expected to inherit emotionally, if not financially. Framed photographs covered one wall. Dad beside the company's first loading dock, Daniel shaking hands with a governor, Mom cutting a ribbon at an expansion ceremony. I was in exactly one picture, taken when I was 19. Martin Hale was waiting upstairs in the conference room. Dad sat at the head of the table. Mom was beside him. Daniel had his laptop open, looking irritated before I'd even taken my seat. "Can we make this quick?" he asked. "Some of us are working." I looked at him. "Good start." "Enough," Dad said. Martin slid a thick binder toward the center of the table. Across the cover were the names Carter Components and North Star Industrial Group. Beneath them was a number, $36 million. Martin explained that North Star had offered to acquire the entire company. Dad wanted to retire. Daniel had spent months helping negotiate the transaction. Mom reached for Dad's hand when retirement was mentioned, and for a second I saw something I rarely allowed myself to see. They were getting older. This wasn't just money to them. It was 40 years of risk finally becoming security. "So why am I here?" I asked. Daniel leaned back. "That's what I'd like to know." Martin opened the binder. "In 2014, after your father's cardiac episode, the company was reorganized. Richard established what the governing documents call a stewardship approval seat." I looked at Dad. He stared at the table. Martin continued. Any sale transferring control of the entire company required approval from that seat after review of several long-term obligations identified in the company documents. Who holds it? I asked. Martin looked directly at me. You do. Nobody spoke. I actually laughed once because the alternative was believing him. I don't own stock. This isn't stock. So I don't get $36 million. No. That answer steadied me more than anything else could have. Whatever this was, it wasn't a secret fortune. What does the seat actually let me do? Martin said. Approve the transaction, reject it, or withhold approval while requesting modifications relevant to the responsibilities covered by the provision. Daniel closed his laptop harder than necessary. Dad created that 12 years ago. Emily wasn't even involved with the company. Which is why I assumed Martin would clean it up, Dad said. There it was. Even after naming me, Dad spoke as though my involvement were an administrative problem. Mom tried to soften it. Your father was recovering. There were a lot of decisions being made. I'm sitting right here, Susan, Dad said. I remember making it. I turned to him. Then why me? His jaw tightened. We're discussing the sale today. Not an answer. Martin pushed a signature page toward me, but kept his hand resting beside it. You are entitled to review the transaction before deciding. Daniel exhaled. Emily, this deal took 8 months. The valuation is excellent. Dad gets to retire. The company gets a buyer with national resources. Nobody is asking you to become an investment banker overnight. That sentence landed harder than he intended. In my family, expertise had always belonged to whoever had the right title. Daniel had the MBA, the executive office, the financial vocabulary. I had sawdust under my nails. For years, when Dad dismissed my choices, I either fought about my worth or went quiet. Both responses kept him at the center of the question. I looked at the signature line. Then I closed the binder. I'm not signing something I haven't read. Daniel stared at me. Seriously? Completely. Dad's expression hardened. Don't turn this into another argument about your life. I'm not. I pulled the binder toward me. For once, I'm trying to understand the decision you put my name on. Martin nodded once. Daniel didn't. And when I left that conference room carrying $36 million worth of paperwork that wasn't worth a penny to me personally, one question followed me all the way to the elevator. Why had my father trusted the family failure with the one signature everyone else suddenly needed? That night, the $36 million binder sat on my kitchen table between a mug of cold coffee and 3 furniture invoices I still needed to send. By midnight, one phrase had appeared often enough that I stopped skimming past it. Operational consolidation. The next morning, I called Martin. What does North Star get to consolidate? After the protected operating period, quite a lot, he said. Plants, departments, administrative functions. Subject to the agreement. How long is the protected period? 18 months. I drove to Carter Components before opening my shop. Daniel met me in the parking lot, coat unbuttoned against the freezing wind. Dad said you had questions. I do. Great. Ask me. Then sign. Inside his office, Daniel walked me through the numbers. North Star had deeper pockets, better distribution, and enough capital to modernize equipment Carter Components had postponed replacing for years. For the first time, I understood why he wanted the deal so badly. It wasn't just his payout. Parts of Dad's company genuinely needed help. Then Daniel showed me a transition chart. One box listed the older Pennsylvania plant as subject to post-integration review. That's the original plant, I said. It's also the least efficient. 140 people work there. 143, Daniel corrected. I know the payroll, Emily. His voice wasn't cruel. That almost made the argument harder. And if we don't sell? I asked. We spend millions modernizing both plants, take on debt, and hope our 2 biggest customers don't move production overseas. There isn't a magical option where nobody risks anything. That stayed with me. I had come looking for proof that Daniel was protecting his money at everyone else's expense. Instead, I found a real business problem. But I also found something he seemed willing to treat as somebody else's problem. Has anyone told the employees consolidation is allowed after 18 months? There's nothing to tell yet. That's not what I asked. Daniel rubbed his forehead. This is why Dad didn't want emotion involved. I looked at him. Dad said the same thing. Because he knows you. You see one person who might get hurt, and suddenly the whole decision becomes about them. And you see a spreadsheet, and forget the numbers have mortgages. His face tightened. I've spent 15 years keeping those people employed. You left. There it was. Not another insult, but the family argument beneath all the others. Daniel stayed and carried responsibility. I left and, in his mind, earned the luxury of criticizing. I couldn't dismiss that. So I made a choice he wasn't expecting. I'm not rejecting the sale. Daniel paused. Then what are you doing? Learning enough that my yes means something. I asked for the plant projections, modernization estimates, severance language, and North Star's transition assumptions. Daniel hesitated, then sent them. That afternoon, Dad called. Martin says you're holding things up. I'm reviewing what you gave me authority to review. Don't confuse authority with expertise. Normally, that would have sent me straight into an argument about my life. Instead, I asked, then why did you choose me? Silence. We'll discuss that when this is settled. No, Dad. That's part of what I need to understand before I settle anything. I ended the call before he could redirect me. For once, I wasn't trying to prove I belonged at their table. I was beginning to ask what the people who weren't sitting there would pay for whatever I signed. The first person I spoke to at the old plant was a woman named Carla who had been sanding burrs off metal housings for 22 years. I hadn't gone there to frighten anyone with rumors about a sale. I told the plant manager I was reviewing long-term operations and wanted to understand what couldn't be seen in the projections. Carla pointed toward a machine behind her. That press is older than my youngest kid, and he's in college. She laughed, but the problem wasn't funny. By lunchtime, I understood something Daniel had been trying to tell me. The plant needed serious investment. Roof repairs had been delayed. 2 production lines were inefficient. A newer automated system could do work that currently required several separate stations. Keeping everything exactly as it was wasn't compassion. It was postponement. So I called North Star's transition director myself. I expected corporate language and got some of it. They planned to invest in the newer plant immediately. The older facility would remain open for at least 18 months, exactly as the agreement required. After that, no promises. Is closure already planned? I asked. No. Is consolidation being modeled? A pause. Yes. That answer mattered. Back at my workshop, I spread the acquisition papers across the same bench where I repaired cracked chair frames. The numbers were beginning to make sense, and that made the decision worse, not easier. Selling could protect the company from risks Dad had been carrying for years. Selling unchanged could also leave a town full of employees absorbing consequences long after my family deposited its checks. Rejecting the deal wasn't clean either. Carter Components would need millions in modernization, probably financed with debt, with no guarantee the investment would save either plant. Mom arrived just before closing. She rarely came to my shop. She stood among stripped cabinets and clamps in a camel wool coat that probably cost more than my first table saw. Your father isn't sleeping, she said. Neither am I. Emily, this sale means he can. Finally stop worrying about payroll and loans and whether one bad year destroys what he spent 40 years building. I wiped sawdust from my hands. I know. She looked genuinely surprised. Then why are you making this difficult? There was the family dynamic in one sentence. Daniel understood the business. Dad carried the burden. Mom protected Dad. And my role was to stop complicating things. Because difficult and wrong aren't the same thing. Mom's expression softened. We aren't saying you're incapable. Dad called me a failure 3 days ago. Your father says things badly when he's frustrated. And you translate them until I'm supposed to pretend they mean something else. She went quiet. I wasn't trying to hurt her. That was simply the first time I'd said it plainly. The next evening Daniel came by with updated projections. He showed me what rejecting the acquisition could require: equipment financing, delayed distributions, possibly freezing management salaries. He wasn't bluffing. There, he said. That's the part you don't see when you're talking to people on the floor. I closed the spreadsheet. I'm seeing both. No, you're trying to make a business transaction morally perfect. It can't be. I never said perfect. Then sign the deal. Not yet. Daniel pushed his chair back. You know what I think this is? I waited. You finally have something Dad and I need, and you like how that feels. The accusation hit because some part of it was true. For one ugly second, I imagined rejecting the sale just to watch Daniel explain to everyone how the family failure had stopped his perfect deal. I hated how satisfying the thought felt. Daniel saw my silence and shook his head. You get to play conscience because you've never had to build anything worth losing. After he left, I stood alone beside the $36 million binder. My hand rested on its cover. I could use the authority Dad had given me to settle every old argument without saying a word. And if I did, I would be making a $36 million decision for the same reason my family had judged me for years, to prove who mattered more. I picked up my phone and called Dad. "Tomorrow," I said when he answered. "Just you and me. I need you to finally tell me why you put my name on that seat." This time, he didn't avoid the question. After a long silence, he said, "All right." Dad chose a diner 20 minutes from Carter Components instead of his office or the house. That alone told me he didn't want Mom smoothing over his words or Daniel turning them into numbers. He was already in a booth when I arrived, stirring coffee he wasn't drinking. I sat across from him and skipped the small talk. "Why me?" Dad looked toward the window. "You really don't remember?" "Remember what?" "The Mercer property." I did, though I hadn't thought about it in years. Before I left business school, I spent one summer helping Carter Components organize records for several properties it planned to sell. One was a small warehouse Dad's company no longer needed. A machinist named Walter Mercer had rented part of it for years. Dad had received an offer from a developer who wanted the building empty quickly. Walter insisted Dad's former business partner had promised him extra time to relocate his equipment. Nothing in the lease required it. I remembered sitting in Dad's office arguing that a promise didn't stop matching because the man who made it had died. "You were furious with me," I said. "I was. You said I didn't understand business." I said worse than that. Dad's eyes stayed on his coffee. He told me what I'd never known. After I pushed him for weeks, he delayed the sale. Walter moved his machines without shutting down his shop, but Carter Components lost money when the developer reduced its offer. At the time, Dad considered that proof that I was too emotional for business. Years later, Walter's son became one of Carter Components' most reliable specialty suppliers. "So it worked out financially," I said. Dad shook his head. "That's not why I'm telling you." He finally looked at me. "Even if Mercer had never done another dollar of business with us, you still would have believed delaying was right." "Yes. That's the part one didn't understand." The waitress refilled his coffee. Neither of us spoke until she walked away. Dad told me that after his health scare, Martin had pushed him to think about what should happen if the family ever sold the entire company. Dad trusted Daniel to understand valuation, debt, taxes, and risk. But he worried that everyone sitting at the negotiating table, including himself, would naturally focus on what the people at that table stood to gain. "I needed one person whose job wasn't to maximize the check," he said. The answer should have felt like vindication. Instead, it made me angry. "You trusted me with that, and still spent years calling me irresponsible." His face tightened. "I didn't say irresponsible. You called me a failure 4 days ago. Because I think you walked away from opportunities most people would kill for." There it was. No secret apology. No revelation that Dad had always believed in me. "So you still think I failed?" He took a breath. "I think you wasted abilities you had. And I think there are things you see that Daniel and I don't see quickly enough. Both can be true." I sat back. For years I'd imagined there were only two possible versions of my father. Either he was right and I'd wasted my life, or someday he'd admit he'd been wrong about everything. I had been waiting for the second version like it would set me free. It wasn't coming. More importantly, I suddenly realized I didn't need it. Dad hadn't put my name on that seat because I was secretly the successful child. He had done it because once, when there was money on one side and a person with no leverage on the other, I'd cared about the cost nobody was required to count. The $36 million binder felt different after that. It wasn't a trophy Dad had hidden for me. It wasn't an apology. It was a question he had arranged years ago for me to answer. "Does Daniel know why you chose me?" I asked. "Not all of it." "Then don't tell him yet." Dad frowned. "Why?" "Because I don't want this turned into another argument about which one of us you trust more." I pulled a notebook from my bag. "I want the modernization estimates for both plants, the buyer's projected savings from consolidation, and every employee protection term North Star has already rejected." Dad studied me. "What are you planning?" "I don't know yet." And for the first time, that answer didn't make me feel inadequate. "But I'm done asking whether signing or rejecting this deal proves you're wrong about me. I want to know whether there's a version of the sale I can actually defend." Dad nodded slowly. I left the diner without an apology, without a fortune, and without finally winning my father's approval. Yet something fundamental had shifted. My family still needed my decision. I had finally stopped needing that decision to tell me who I was. The next morning, I stopped asking whether Carter components should be sold and started asking what a responsible sale would look like. That distinction changed everything. I spent 2 hours with Martin going line by line through the stewardship approval seat. He was careful not to tell me what decision to make. He explained what I could legitimately consider and where my authority ended. You can't rewrite the acquisition, he said. But you can withhold approval while requesting modifications tied to the long-term obligations identified here. Employees and operating continuity, among other things. So I can negotiate. You can require conditions for your approval. North Star can refuse them. That mattered. I didn't have magical power over a $36 million company. I had leverage, and leverage only worked if I was prepared for the other side to walk away. I spent the rest of the day building a list. At first, it was too ambitious. 5-year job guarantees. No plant closures. Mandatory staffing levels. When I showed it to Daniel, he stared at me. They'll walk. Then tell me what could survive negotiation. He seemed almost disappointed that I had asked. We spent an hour arguing, but this time the argument was useful. Daniel explained why permanent employment guarantees could make the acquisition impossible if demand collapsed. I crossed them out. I proposed a longer operating commitment for the older plant, funded retraining if consolidation eventually happened, severance tied to years of service, and a formal modernization review before North Star could decide closure was cheaper than investment. Daniel read the revised page twice. This still costs money. I know. Our money. Potentially. You say that like it doesn't matter. It matters. It just isn't the only thing that matters. He leaned against the conference table. You really think Dad picked you because you're the conscience of the family? There was an old version of me that would have taken the bait. No, I said. I think Dad gave me a specific responsibility. That's all. Daniel's expression changed slightly. He had expected me to turn Dad's explanation into a new family ranking, with me finally on top. I wasn't going to. North Star rejected my first proposal within 24 hours. Their transition director called the operating commitment too restrictive and the severance package too expensive. So I asked for their numbers. How much would the older plant cost to modernize? What savings did consolidation create? What portion came from eliminating positions rather than improving production? For 3 days, my workshop became a second office. I restored a walnut dining table in the mornings and reviewed acquisition spreadsheets at night. I wasn't suddenly an investment banker. When I didn't understand something, I called Daniel, Martin, or North Star and asked until I did. Strangely, admitting what I didn't know made it harder for my family to dismiss what I did know. Mom came to the shop again on Friday. This time she brought coffee instead of an argument. Daniel says you're negotiating with North Star. I'm asking for changes. Your father could lose several $1 million if they lower the offer. I know. She sat on a stool near my workbench. Emily, you've spent years saying money isn't everything. Maybe that's easier to say when you don't have this much to lose. I set down my sanding block. It was a fair question, even if I didn't like hearing it. Maybe. But the employees don't have $36 million to lose. They have jobs. And your father has 40 years in that company. I'm not forgetting him. It feels like you are. I looked at her. Mom, when you say I should make the mature decision, what decision do you mean? She hesitated. The one that doesn't destroy a good opportunity. The one Daniel wants. The one that makes sense. Those aren't automatically the same thing. She opened her mouth, then stopped. For years, my family had treated their preferred answer as evidence of maturity and disagreement as evidence that I hadn't grown up. Naming that pattern made it visible in a way arguing never had. On Monday, North Star sent a counterproposal. They would extend the operating commitment, fund retraining, strengthen severance, and conduct the modernization review. They would not promise the old plant would stay open forever. I hadn't asked them to. But there was one sentence at the bottom of the email that tightened my stomach. Requested protections will require adjustment to transaction economics. I forwarded it to Daniel. He called 30 seconds later. Do you understand what that means? They're lowering the offer. Yes. How much? They haven't said. For once, neither of us argued. The number arrived the following afternoon. I opened the revised term sheet alone at my workbench. The original offer was still printed at the top of the old binder beside me. $36 million. The revised proposal read, $32,800,000. I stared at the difference. $3.2 million. Not mine. Not imaginary. Real money my father, my brother, and other shareholders would no longer receive because of conditions I had insisted Northstar price into the deal. My phone started ringing before I finished the page. Daniel. Then Mom. Then Dad. I let all three calls go unanswered for 60 seconds and looked at the repaired table in front of me, remembering something Dad had finally forced me to understand at the diner. Seeing the people outside the room was easy when nobody made you calculate what seeing them would cost the people inside it. Now I had the number, and everyone in my family was about to ask whether my principals were worth $3.2 million of their money. Daniel was waiting in Dad's conference room when I arrived the next morning. The revised offer lay beside the original binder, $36 million on one side of the table, $32.8 on the other. For once, nobody needed to explain what the difference meant. $3.2 million, Daniel said. That's what your conditions cost. That's what Northstar priced them at. Call it whatever makes you comfortable. Dad sat near the window, looking older than he had 2 weeks earlier. Mom had a legal pad in front of her, but hadn't written anything. I looked at Daniel. Do you think the protections are unreasonable? That's not the point. It's exactly the point. He hesitated. No, they're not unreasonable. But reasonable things still have prices. That was the most honest thing anyone had said all morning. Daniel's executive payout would shrink. Dad would receive less for the company he'd spent 40 years building. Other shareholders would take less too, and I would lose almost nothing financially. That imbalance bothered me. It should have. Mom folded her hands. Emily, nobody is asking you to betray your principles. We're asking whether $3.2 million is a reasonable price for them. I looked down at both offers. There were 3 choices now, and none let me leave clean. Approve the original deal, and the family would finally call me practical while employees carried risks we had negotiated away from ourselves. Reject the acquisition entirely, and I could protect my conscience while leaving Carter Components facing aging equipment, debt, and an uncertain future. Or approve the revised deal, knowing I was reducing money that mostly belonged to other people. Daniel leaned toward me. You're spending money that isn't yours. Exactly, I said, which is why I'm trying to remember it isn't only yours either. His face hardened. Dad finally spoke. I don't agree with the revised price. Everyone turned toward him. For 1 second, the daughter in me wanted him to finish the sentence by telling them he trusted me anyway. He didn't. I created the seat so the decision wouldn't automatically be mine, he said. That means I don't get to take it back because I dislike what it costs. It wasn't permission. It wasn't approval. It was simply the boundary he had created years ago. The rest belonged to me. That evening, I returned to my workshop alone. I wrote 3 headings on a sheet of paper: original, revised, reject. Under each, I listed who benefited, who carried risk, and what couldn't be undone. Then I added one final question. Which choice would I make if nobody in my family ever changed their opinion of me? I stared at it for a long time. That was the question I'd spent 15 years avoiding. If I signed the original deal to earn their respect, they still controlled me. If I killed the sale to punish them, they still controlled me. By midnight, I knew which document I could put my name on. I closed the binder, called Martin, and said, set the meeting for tomorrow. I'm ready to decide. The conference room looked exactly as it had the first day, except now there were 2 versions of the future sitting on the table. Martin had placed the original $36 million agreement on my left and Northstar's revised $32.8 million offer on my right. Dad sat across from me. Mom was beside him. Daniel stood near the windows, too restless to sit. Martin reviewed the mechanics one final time. No speech. No surprise clause. No new information that could make the choice easier. Then he slid the approval page toward me and stopped talking. Daniel broke the silence. Before you do this, I want you to understand something. That $3.2 million isn't coming out of Northstar's pocket. It's coming out of ours. I understand. Dad gets less. I get less. Every shareholder gets less. I understand that too. Mom looked at me carefully. Then please don't make this about what happened at dinner. I almost smiled, because 2 weeks earlier that sentence would have sent me straight into a defense of my entire life. It isn't. How can it not be? Daniel asked. Dad calls you a failure, and suddenly you have the power to cost us millions. There it was, the version of the story everyone could understand. Revenge would have been simple, so would surrender. I put my hand on the original agreement. Part of me wants to sign this one, I said. Daniel blinked. Then do it. Not because I think it's better. Because if I sign it, you'll call me practical. Mom will say I finally understand responsibility. Dad might even decide I didn't waste my life. Dad lowered his eyes. I moved my hand away. And part of me wants to reject the sale completely. Just so none of you can ever call me powerless again. Nobody interrupted. Both choices would still be about you. I pulled the revised agreement toward me. This one isn't perfect. The old plant could still close someday. People could still lose jobs. Northstar still gets to make business decisions we won't control. But the company gets the investment it needs. Dad gets to retire. And the people who spent years building the value we're selling get more time, better severance, retraining, and an actual modernization review before somebody decides they're cheaper to eliminate. Daniel shook his head. For $3.2 million. Yes. I didn't soften it. For $3.2 million. Money that isn't yours. That's exactly why I took this seriously. I looked at Dad. You didn't give me this seat to maximize what our family takes out of the company. You already had people who knew how to do that. Then I looked back at Daniel. And you were right about something. I didn't spend 15 years running Carter Components. I don't carry what you carry. That's why I listened when you explained what rejecting the sale could do. But listening to you doesn't mean handing you my judgment. Daniel's jaw tightened. So that's it. No. This is. I picked up the pen. For years, I had imagined proving my family wrong would feel like winning an argument. Instead, it felt strangely quiet. I signed the approval for the revised $32.8 million transaction. Martin took the page and checked the signature. Nothing dramatic happened. No one applauded. No one apologized. The building didn't shake because the family failure had made a multi-million-dollar decision. Daniel stared at the document. You just cost this family $3.2 million. I capped the pen. Then that's the price of the decision I'm willing to put my name on. Mom looked hurt. Daniel looked furious. Dad was harder to read. After a long silence, he said, You understand they're going to blame you if those protections don't save the plant. I know. And Daniel may never agree with you. I know that too. Dad nodded once. Not approval. Recognition. That was enough. I stood and pushed my chair in. The $36 million document was still on the table and signed by me. 2 weeks earlier, I would have seen that page as the chance to finally prove I wasn't the failure of the family. Now I understood something better. Power wasn't getting the last word. It was being responsible for the choice after everyone else stopped talking, and being willing to live with what your signature cost. The sale closed in March. Carter Components became part of Northstar. Dad officially retired, and nobody woke up the next morning feeling like a winner. That was probably the most honest outcome possible. The old plant stayed open under the extended operating commitment, and Northstar began the modernization review we had negotiated. Nobody pretended that guaranteed the plant forever. The retraining fund was established, the stronger severance terms became part of the transition plan, and the employees had more protection than they would have received under the original $36 million agreement. My family received less money. Dad never complained about his reduced payout, although I knew exactly what it had cost him. Daniel's reaction was different. He remained convinced I had forced personal values into a transaction that should have been judged primarily as business. We could be in the same room without fighting, but something between us stayed unfinished. Strangely, I stopped needing to finish it. For most of my adult life, disagreement with Daniel had felt like evidence I was losing some invisible competition. Now it was simply disagreement. Mom had a harder adjustment. At a family lunch that spring, she started telling relatives about Daniel's new executive position with Northstar. Then she turned toward me. And Emily still has her little. She stopped. I knew what was coming. Little workshop. The harmless phrase that somehow always made my life sound temporary. Mom caught herself. Emily has her restoration business, she said instead. It wasn't a dramatic apology. I appreciated it more because it wasn't. Later, while we cleared dishes, I told her, You don't have to make Daniel's life smaller to make mine bigger. She looked confused. I wasn't. I know. I'm saying you don't have to rank us at all. She leaned against the counter. I suppose we did that more than I realized. You did. I didn't rescue her from the discomfort. I didn't punish her with it either. Dad came to my workshop a week later carrying an old wooden drafting stool. I recognized the faded Carter Components stencil underneath before he put it down. This was in the original plant, he said. first drafting station I ever had. One leg was loose, the seat was cracked, and somebody had driven the wrong screws into 2 joints decades earlier. "Can you fix it?" he asked. "Probably." Dad walked around the shop while I examined it. He ran his hand across a walnut cabinet I'd just refinished. There was no offer to invest in my business. No suggestion that I expand. No speech about how I could turn the shop into something bigger if I finally got serious. That absence told me more than a compliment would have. Eventually, he said, "I was wrong to call you a failure." I looked up from the stool. For years, I had wanted those exact words. Hearing them now felt good, but they didn't rearrange anything inside me. "You were," I said. Dad nodded. "You proved that." I shook my head. "That's not what I mean." He waited. "You were wrong to think either Daniel or I needed to prove which one of us was the success story." Dad looked at the floor for a moment. "Fair enough. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. Daniel still believed I cost the family too much. Mom still occasionally slipped into comparing careers. Dad and I still disagreed about what I had done with my opportunities. But the family order had changed in one important way. I no longer accepted money, titles, or Dad's approval as the scoreboard for my worth. And because I stopped participating, everyone else had less power to keep the competition alive. Looking back, the $36 million document wasn't valuable because it secretly made me rich. It didn't. It was valuable because it put responsibility where resentment could easily have taken over. I had enough power to punish my family and enough insecurity to want their approval. I chose neither. Family love doesn't require agreement, and fairness doesn't mean nobody pays a price. But family relationships become dangerous when respect is conditional on achievement. Responsibility belongs only to the favored person, and boundaries are treated as betrayal. A healthier family isn't one where everyone ends up equal in money or status. It's one where nobody has to become smaller so somebody else can remain the winner. I restored Dad's drafting stool and returned it without making it perfect. A few scratches were too deep to erase without destroying the wood around them. Dad ran his fingers over one of them when I gave it back. "You left this mark." I did. "Why?" I smiled. "Because repaired isn't the same as never damaged." He understood. So did I.